Bodacious buttonmeisters of Swift, it's Prof. G, and in this lesson we're going to work with button styles, introduce the spacer view, learn about the frame modifier, and we'll recognize optional parameters, how to add them, and how to select just the parameters we want using code completion. We'll have a bunch of mini challenges, and we'll set us up for a larger full project challenge in the next lesson. Let us begin to hack. If you're new here, welcome. You might want to check out the course playlist to see how we got here. Now, before we get started, I pointed out that you should be committing and pushing your work to GitHub after each lesson. This way you always have a backup available in the cloud. Now, we can see that I have uncommitted changes here because we've got the unsaved changes indicator showing on the left-hand side of the code editor, and there's an M next to the content view file in the project navigator showing that there are unsaved modifications since the last commit. But we know how to commit and push. Let's head to the integrate menu, select commit, click the stage all button, enter a commit message. I'll say after button variable and state lesson, then pull down the menu and the commit button over here on the side, select commit and push, click the push button here, and after a chug, we can head back to the project navigator, and in our content view, the M is gone. We no longer have any unsaved changes modifications, so now let us unleash the learning of bigness. So by the end of the last lesson, we had this simple app with a large system image of a Swift in orange, a text view that states, "I am a programmer" in large title font, in heavy font weight with red color, and we added a button. Click it, and it changes the text view to read, "Awesome." Now our button is pretty basic, pretty mid as the hipster youngsters say, so let's change the button style. Now remember, to modify a view, we add modifiers. They go just below the view statement. They start with a period, so after the closing curly of the buttons action, I'm going to press return, and on this new line, I'll enter dot, and I'll enter the word button. Now look at this. Xcode shows us several options for modifiers for the button. We want this one called ButtonStyle. So use your up or down arrow keys to highlight this. And code completion says this sets the style for the buttons within this view. That's what we want to do. If we look between the parentheses, we see that this wants input between those parens as something called a primitive button style. Now at this stage we don't know what that is, but we do know that Xcode helps us out, and if we press a period, it will show us all of the predefined styles of that type. So first let's press return to accept the button style modifier, and then period to show us the various styles. We see several options in here. In iOS, both automatic and borderless produce the plain tinted button that we see here. You can try out dot bordered. This shows a button with a gray border, but let's try dot bordered prominent, and that's even nicer. So again, feel free to get back in here after the lesson and experiment with the different styles. But now let me give you a quick challenge. You might take a look at this button and say, hey, the font is kind of small. I would like a bigger font. Why don't you change the font to Title II? And you should know how to do this. Why don't you pause the video? I bet you can do it. And when you're ready, why don't you resume, and we'll compare answers. So this is what I was expecting. Below the button style modifier, we add a new line. We'll press dot. Remember, the modifier to change the font is dot font. And in between its parentheses, we're just going to pass in the value dot title II. And look at that. That makes the button a little bit larger. Very cool. Now let's change the color of the button. We'll riz it up, as the youngsters say. My daughter would be mortified to hear me say that. Now you might think that we could use the foreground style modifier that we used up here, but when we want to change the color for interactive items, meaning items that you can click on like buttons, we use a different modifier. It's called dot tint. So let's enter that in the line below. Code completion says dot tint will set the tint color for the view. That's what we want. It takes a color. Cool. Press return to accept this. Between the parentheses, we'll enter another dot. We see Xcode will allow us to scroll through a bunch of predefined colors. And why don't we make this orange as well? Nice. Now I want to demonstrate a few more techniques, but before we get there, to set things up, why don't we have another challenge? So I'd like you to modify your code so it looks and behaves like the app at the right. The text should be in ultra light font this time. The text color should be in default color, which is black. There should be two buttons side by side. One labeled awesome, that when clicked changes the text view to read awesome, exclamation point. And the second labeled great, that when clicked changes the text view to great, exclamation point. The button should be bordered prominent style, in orange color, in Title II font. So why don't you pause, give this a shot, you know what to do, and when you're done, we'll compare answers. Well, first, since we're going to use the standard text color, I'm going to get rid of the foreground style in red here, and I'm going to change the font weight to ultra light. And I'll reuse this button here, but the title should be awesome. And if I want to have another button just like this side by side, remember we want to embed that in an H stack. And in an earlier lesson, we learned that if we do a 2-finger click on the view name, this pulls up a context menu. Some people call this the right-click menu. That brings up a bunch of different options, and the context will change based on what you clicked on. Now, since we clicked on a view in here, we get a bunch of embed options. One of them is embed in HStack. Click that. And now we got the HStack around our button and modifiers. And we want a second set of almost identical button and modifiers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all the button code and its 3 modifiers, copy it with Command-C, and then down below, but inside the HStack still, we'll paste them in with a Command-V. Modify this second button so that its name is great and that the message is great exclamation point. Try it out a few times. It's working great even after a reset. Nice. Now let me offer you a pro tip, and this doesn't work in all situations, but in this particular situation, we've got 2 buttons in here that have an identical 3 modifiers in them, and they're surrounded by an H-stack. Well, one thing we can do is we can actually put the 3 modifiers outside of the H-stack so that we only have to write them once instead of twice inside the H-stack under each view. This is what I mean. I'm going to highlight these 3 modifiers under the first button, cut it out with a Command-X, then I'm going to delete the 3 modifiers under the second button, and then after the closing curly in the H-stack, I'm going to paste in those 3 modifiers, and look at that. My 2 buttons each have these 3 modifiers applied to them, and I have less code that I've written. It should also be easier to maintain, because if I decide I want to change the font or the color, I only have to do it in one place instead of 2. Nice. Up next, I want to show you the spacer view. What the spacer view does is it adds as much blank space as it can between views. So for example, if I want to push my image and text to the top and the H-stack with the buttons to the bottom, I can just add a spacer in here. That's a new view I'm going to add above the H-stack and below the text view. I type in spacer. I'm going to select this option with the open and close parens. For some reason, my Xcode doesn't offer a description, but press return and let's see what this does. Spacer has 2 parens. We didn't put anything inside of it, but look what it did. It pushes everything above the spacer up and everything below the spacer down. Now, what if you want to keep that H-stack along the bottom, but you want to put the image and the text in the middle? Well, what we can do is we can add a second spacer. Just after the V-stack starts and before the image view, we'll type in another spacer with open and close parens. And look at this, it pushed the image and the text into the center. So what happens here is if we have 2 spacers, each of those spacers takes up half of the available space. Since one spacer is at the top of the V-stack, it pushes everything below it down. And since the other spacer is after the text and before the H-stack, it will push the H-stack with the buttons to the bottom, but everything above it, the image view and the text view, upward. And since the image and text view is between 2 spacers, those are balanced in the middle of the screen. So again, you can experiment with this. You can put multiple spacers in there as well. Each spacer would then take up 1/3 of the space available. And now, curious person that you are, you might wonder, what happens if I put a spacer in an H-stack? Let's try it out. So in between our 2 buttons, why don't we put spacer in here, open and close parens, and ho-ho, the 2 buttons are pushed out to the sides. So a spacer in a V-stack pushes views vertically, spacers in an H-stack pushes views horizontally. I think I like the buttons the other way, so I'm going to remove the spacer from the H-stack. And before we finish up this lesson and head to another project challenge, I want to show you the frame modifier. The frame modifier positions a view inside of an invisible frame of a specific size. And this can be quite useful. Say, for example, we want to keep our Swift in a box that's only 200 by 200 points. Now that might not mean anything to you, but the resolution for the iPhone 16 Pro is 402 points across. These are not pixels. We'll talk about that in a future lesson. Again, I don't want to overload you with too much context here, but 200 by 200 should take up about half of the width of the screen, and a frame modifier will let us do that. So let's make some space below the image view and after the image view's foreground style modifier, and we'll start by typing .frame. And there's a few things to note here. Now, one is we want this top option here, the one with 3 parameters, width, height, and alignment. Now, code completion defines this just as we said, positions the view inside an invisible frame with a specified size. Now also notice the 3 parameters are grayed out and italicized. Gray and italics means that these parameters are optional. If we press return here, watch what happens. I get empty parens with no parameters. Now you usually want parameters in here. So how do I get the width, height, and alignment to show up? Well, let's backspace and retype .frame. And the one thing you can do here is hold down the Option key. Look what happens as you hold down Option. Those 3 parameters that were previously grayed out, well, now they're black. So if you hold down the Option key while those parameters are black and press return, all those parameters will be entered. Well, all right. But now, what if you want only one of those parameters? Well, you can type this in manually, or you can delete any of the parameters that are in there. That's no problem, but it's really great to use code completion whenever you can, because you'll get the argument labels, the colons are entered, any commas, the arguments will be in the proper order, and code completion helps you avoid typos. So let's learn a few more tricks. We'll type .frame again, and we'll see over here on the right-hand side, there's this thing that looks like a big greater than symbol. It's actually not a greater than symbol, it's called a right chevron, and if we press the right arrow on our keyboard, we see, whoa, it's now a downward pointing chevron, and now we get every combination of those three parameters listed for us. You can move your cursor keys and select the option you want. So say I want just height. I can select that, press return, and just height shows up with a colon. Nice. We see this wants something called CG float. For now, just know that that means a number that can have a decimal point in it. Let's just enter 30 in here, and whoa, I shrink down my image. It's only 30 points high. It's not distorted because above this I've got a scale to fit modifier, but there's also another shortcut to use, and this is the one I'm going to use most often, and you should be using it too. So what if I want height and width? Well, I'm going to delete what I have in here and retype .frame again, and now watch what happens. So I've got the word frame in here, and without typing any space, I'm going to type WI, and look what happened. Those characters WI are no longer gray. They're black inside of the first parameter that can identify that has a W and I in it. That's width. Those characters in black mean that if I were to press return right now, I would get the width parameter. But we're not done. Again, without pressing a space in here, I can type HE, and look at that. The HE in the height parameter are also in black. So with WI and HE in the width and the height in black, if I press return here, I'm going to get just those two parameters. Look at alignment. That doesn't have anything in black. It's still all grayed out, so I'm not going to select the alignment parameter. Why don't you join me in pressing return? And look at this, we get width and height. Why don't we enter 200 for the width, tab over, 200 for the height. Very cool. We have an invisible 200 by 200 box constraining our Swift. It's looking smaller, but still Swiftacular. With this lesson done, don't forget to commit and push. And with that, Swifter, you're now armed for a full project challenge, which we'll have in the next video. But first, bask in the glorious accomplishment of more big learning. We had some mini challenges in here. You learned how to format a button style, working with the spacer. We learned about the frame modifier, but also about optional parameters and how we can select optional parameters in code completion. Our next lesson will present you with a challenge where you create a new project and apply everything you've learned, and I'll show you the solution right after. I hope you feel like you're learning big. Continue to hack.